Now, the first thing this morning that I want to talk about is the main points that we must keep in mind when we are making materials for children. And these points that Dr. Montessori found were essential, because there's no doubt that the manufacturers are just proliferating material today for the classroom and for the home, calling everything educational material, but there's hardly a piece that you can use, because there are so many mistakes in the piece that the child can't learn through it. It's very difficult for us, if we haven't had any training in what to look for, to judge whether a piece of material is good or not. And we are certainly spending a tremendous amount of money on these materials, both in the schools and in the home, because all the parents think that by using these they can increase the rate by which the child learns, and they'll have a child who's ahead of other children. Of course, in fact, we can't increase the rate at which the development, the intelligence develops. But what we can do, by giving the right help, we can see that he achieves to a higher level at each point. And that's something quite different. See? So, but if he achieves his potential all the way along, then of course he will end up as a more intelligent person. But the stages in which the mind develops will be the same for all children, and you cannot accelerate growth any more than you can accelerate physical growth. So the materials are never meant to accelerate the development of the intelligence. They are meant to be materials which the child, in using, will reach the optimum development of the stage in which he is. Now, in order to develop, he needs to use the whole of himself. You can't just develop the mind in isolation from the rest of the person. And so the nervous system, the muscles, and the senses are involved. See? And we have not in education thought about the development of the senses. But in fact, nothing goes into the mind that doesn't go through the senses. See? And in the beginning, before the child has been able to build up conceptions intellectually, he is entirely dependent on his senses for everything. And the first sense, of course, that he uses is the sense of touch. It depends very much for a long time, even when he's using sight and so on. Touch means far more to the children than to us. We, partly through our schooling, in which we had to sit still and just listen, you see, have almost stopped using our sense of touch. Our hands, I suppose, are less well developed than any generation, the hands of any generation has ever been, you see, which is very serious. Well, now then, if we are going to make this material that the children can use when they're really young, we must remember that they're not learning through the medium of language. Even at 2.5, when the child is speaking in full sentences, he does only have about 450 words. All children who have been exposed to a rich language will have that level, you see. After that, of course, those with a better exposure will increase vocabulary, and those who are allowed to talk and who are conversed with will increase their use of language at a very rapid rate. But at that point, they do not have many words, and it is still difficult for them to comprehend what we mean when we talk to them, you see. So that when we give a lesson, language is not really involved, or the minimum of words are involved. So the child has to be able to learn through the material itself. The first thing we have to think about is we want to teach something, we want to give him some conception, and therefore we have to devise a piece of material which will isolate what we are teaching. See? So that the child's whole attention will be focused on that one thing. With the cylinders it was size, you see, and all the other facets that could have been involved, like color or texture or shape, you see, were neutralized, as it were. So the material does isolate the difficulty, or isolate, we shouldn't call it a difficulty, isolate whatever it is that we are teaching, and neutralize the other factors. This is almost never done with the educational materials you see on the market. They're practically always, for example, very highly colored, because the bright colors are supposed to attract the child's attention, or they certainly attract the parents, you know. But it's a misconception. And it's usually the same bright colors, yellow, you know, orange, blue, just a few of the colors, and rather crude colors at that. Now, again, if we're going to teach anything, we must gradually lead to, you might say, a full classification of what you are teaching. You see, those cylinders, at first he started with the most extreme, all 3 dimensions were involved, and then 2, and then 1, so that he was led from something easy, and the exercise got progressively harder, so as to really give this refinement. And we must give the full classification. You see, if we were going to give color, which I shall be showing you this morning, we must make sure that we put all the colors there before we finish. See, we'll start with a few extreme, but then it's not helpful just to give him a few of the colors. He must have all the colors, so that when he then begins to observe the environment and becomes very aware of color around him, he will have a classification in his mind somewhere where he can pigeonhole everything he sees. Or I think it's Piaget who talks about the mind as though it was a card index, and that's quite a good way of thinking of it, you see. So he must have every color so that he can see different shades of green, but he knows them as the classification green. So we must, you see very often the child is just given 1 or 2 shapes instead of all the shapes, regular shapes there are. We shall see that in a piece of material later. So we give the complete classification so that the child can relate everything he sees into this orderly conception in his mind. Then the piece of material must be graded in difficulty. You see, all that set of materials with which we are going to teach anything, a special thing, there must be this gradation in difficulty so that he starts very simply. When he has understood something very easy, then the material leads him on. It's easier to recognize identities, and so with most of the material he will start by pairing. Well, he did really with the cylinders, you see. He paired the cylinders to their sockets. So he was recognizing the identities. So we start with this pairing, and then we would move on to gradations. You see, it would be more difficult. But so that he's getting more and more refinement. You see, his mind is working. Then after he has understood whatever it is, he has a sort of knowledge of size. Then the next step would be to make him that knowledge into conscious knowledge. And in order to make the knowledge conscious, you have to have a word. Once you are aware of anything, you give it a name, you see. And with the name, you can then think about it, and you can express yourself, because words are the language of thought. And so the next step, when he was really using the material perfectly, knew it really well, the next step would be to teach him any names, give him the language, you see, with which to make the knowledge into conscious knowledge, with which to express himself, with which to think. And then you will find that he becomes a great observer of the environment. He reaches an abstract conception of size. See, at first the child sees size as this table is big, or this chair, or my daddy is big. See, but he doesn't see size as something which everything has size. He doesn't see it in this abstract form. He is aware that well, my jersey is red. My mum is always saying, put on my red jersey, you know. Or cushion is red, but he doesn't see redness as a quality that can apply to anything. But gradually, through using the materials, he does reach this abstract conception. And then he becomes observant of the environment. But he observes the environment with intelligence. Now, it may seem strange to think that his attention has to be drawn to the qualities of the environment. Colors are around us. We're very aware of color. Well, can't he see color when he's surrounded by all these colors? But in fact, if you're not made aware, you go through life without seeing what there is. We have been doing designs, geometrical designs with the other class, and the students for the first time are becoming aware of the designs on their own clothes, on the floors, on curtain materials. You see, and immediately there's this enrichment of the environment and this greater enjoyment of the environment. You see. And children, can go through life without being aware of colour, or very imperfect awareness, although it's such a dominant factor. And it used to be very common when I started teaching to have children come in at 5 and 6 who didn't know the colours. If you said to them, what a nice jersey you've got, what colour is it? They wouldn't know, you see. So, and their artwork showed this lack of observation. And there are primitive tribes in the world who are not aware of colours. They have colours all around them just as much as we do. The flowers, the water, the sky, the trees. But they are unaware of it. And we know this because they don't have words for all the colours. Once you are aware, you make a word. And so if you have people in Africa who have one colour to express orange or yellow or red, they cannot be aware. You see, one word for green and blue and those. You see, they can't really be interested in colour. They can't mean anything to them. So we know ourselves that the majority of us, are very unaware of shape. See? And yet shapes are around us just as much as colour is around us. See? So this material will lead the child on to this intelligent observation of what is around him. Now, no child can ever learn if he is not also active. And Dr. Montessori, again, was the person who first pointed out that it was absolutely essential at all stages of development to allow of movement. Now, of course, this is one thing that troubles us as adults, and we have always, all down the generations, thought of ways to keep the child imprisoned, especially in the first years, you see, so that he couldn't move around and we could devote less time to him. And certainly as soon as he went to school, a good teacher was one who could keep her children absolutely immobile, without moving and without speaking, you see. And this, it's amazing to think that that was one of Dr. Montessori's first reforms, was to insist that children had to move, that they could not be kept sitting still, you see, and that they had to talk. Otherwise, social development couldn't take place, language, and so on. But movement, she insisted always that the child did not learn when he was not moving. See, and that at every point of the development of the intelligence, development of the mind, there was the characteristic movement of that stage. Of course, Sagan before her insists on this, how important movement is. I think if she hadn't been a medical doctor, she might not have realized all these points. But it's very hard for us to see how completely different the schools are today, and it is due to her work. When she used to describe the schools to us, long rows of these benches screwed to the floor, children sitting on backless benches and so on, you used to think that it wasn't really possible. But there are still schools in the world like that, and one has seen them. Well, the mistake made with a small baby is to tuck it up tightly, especially in a country where it does have to have some covering, you see, so that it can't move freely whenever it's awake. And almost from birth, it begins lots of little movements, and its hands move about rather aimlessly at first. It grasps things, but the grasp is not under the control of the will at first. But it rapidly becomes so. You will grasp anything, your finger, anything. But very quickly it does become a voluntary movement. And if we stop the natural movement at any stage, then everything goes wrong. The child wriggles, he moves, he exercises, he discovers things through his hands mainly at first. Then at last he gets to the point where he can roll over. You see? Then comes the point where he can sit up. So these are the main things. See? And then comes the point where he can crawl. Now this is of course where he does come up against us, because if a baby crawling all over the place, we'd be terrified that it would get into danger or something. So we confine it in a playpen. See? And immediately he's imprisoned. He can't crawl around. Very essential developments do not take place. The mind can't develop because he is not finding out all about his environment through touch. You see? It's all right to put him in there for a few minutes while you go and answer the telephone. But you can easily make a safe environment for a child to crawl about in. And also certain eye brain development doesn't take place. Because in crawling, his eyes are working in a certain relationship with the floor. And we don't know fully what takes place at each stage, but all we really need to know is that we must let natural movements take place whenever these things happen. So we only have to follow nature with the baby. Now, one bad thing is when he's put in a playpen is the fact that he then grasps, he has this very strong grasp. He grasps the sides of his playpen, pulls himself up, and balances by holding onto the sides of the playpen, and walks sideways round and round the playpen. You see, because he is having to trying to get out and so on. And this means that before he's ready to stand on his feet, he's standing on them. Now, before you are ready to stand, again, the things have to have happened. Your bones have to have ossified. The baby's bones are very cartilaginous, especially the feet and the legs, you know, these little soft, almost shapeless feet. They're lovely, the baby's feet, aren't they? But they're not ready to stand on. And the cerebellum, that part of the brain at the base which controls equilibrium, that suddenly develops, you see, just before walking is to take place, and that controls balance. And the fontanelles, these gaps between the bones of the skull, which enable the baby's brain to develop after birth, you see, have to close. Because before he's going to walk, when he walks, he tumbles on his head very often, hits himself, and he might damage the brain if those fontanelles haven't closed. Well, he goes round and round the playpen on his toes, and the result is malformation of the legs. See, we think we have done away with things like rickets in our modern civilization, but you only had to look at the miniskirts to see how many it did show up many knock knees and slight deformities, yes. Marvellous if you had well-shaped legs, but very tough fashion, I think. And he's going on his toes. So this crawling is very essential, you see. And as it makes all these discoveries. So all the time that learning is taking place is always in connection with movement. And it is the nervous system, muscles moving your hands, and the nervous system transmitting the messages to your brain. See, but it's your hands that are active, and or any of your senses, and then transmitting the knowledge to the brain. So this material, when we make it, must allow of activity, and especially activity of the hands, because it is the hands that discover and feed the brain. And it's a man's hands that have enabled him to reach a high pitch of civilization. When we learn about other civilizations, past civilizations, is always what the hands have left behind that give us our knowledge of the civilization. See? And the degree of the civilization has reached a higher or lower degree of achievement according to what it has produced with the hands. See? And always the hands make the discovery before the mind. Like a man must have doodled with clay, played about with clay, long time before they thought of shaping a pot. So he must have knocked stones together, discovered the properties of the stone long before they made those wonderful weapons out of stones. So, but it's the hands that always lead the mind. So the material has to be such that he can move and use his hands. Now, with the cylinders, you see the hands were active all the time, as well as the eyes. With the pink tower, he was moving about on the mat. And if you watch a child sitting there with the cylinders, maybe he sits at a table, but his body is moving as well as his hands. They stand to work, they kneel with one leg on the chair, they're in perpetual motion. I don't think a 2-year-old or 2.5, I think any of you who've looked after them know they're never still, are they? There's always this movement. And so the material has to have this possibility of movement of the hands. Then it needs to be self-educative. You see, we can't explain color, we can't explain size. The child has to have this experience and be able to sit there and concentrate and reach a point of understanding. And of course he can't do this just in one lesson. The material has to allow of repeated activity. He has to do the same thing over and over again for a very long time, much longer than we think, before he does really reach abstract conclusions. So once we have shown him how to use a piece of material, you see, he is going to teach himself He's going to help himself to the piece of material. If it's right for his stage of development, then nature makes him want to use it. See, it's telling him to do certain things at each stage of development. And so there's no need to make him. In fact, if you make him do things, then you tire him. But he will concentrate for long periods and go to the same piece day after day and use it over a very long period of time. That's hard for us to realize because our aim is always to do something quickly. The aim in education has always been to make children learn things quickly and rush on to the next thing. Well, we cannot learn quickly. We have to mature slowly, you see, and through this repetition. So there again, the material will allow this repetition and of the self-education. And we never try and make them learn quickly or measure one child up against another. So. Well then, also another thing that children do when they're young is to assimilate the beauty of their surroundings. We say a person is cultured, meaning that they have absorbed the highest discipline of the race. See, culture is not the supermarket, that's the way of life. The culture is the highest that a race has reached in architecture, art, and so on. See, writing, study. And if the child is to appreciate the best that is produced, you see, then he has to have a very beautiful surrounding and the best that there is in his first years. The best in music, the best in art, everything well made. So here again, Dr. Montessori did design very beautiful material. See, well shaped, well constructed. See, and she was a very artistic person. See, and she insisted that everything we did for the children should be lovely. If she had a picture on the wall, she had a reproduction of one of the great painters. She did not have one of these crude things somebody had just scribbled off for children. And of course the great Italian paintings do give you the sentiment as well. So they would be achieving that. But she had very beautiful classrooms, very simple, but very beautiful. Anything she brought into the classroom was beautiful. No matter if they were the very poorest children she was dealing with, she knew that they could come up to the highest level just as well as a child born into a cultured family. So a beautiful material, very well made, and therefore very durable. Now this means that initially perhaps a piece of material may be more expensive than something cheaply and poorly produced, but it is going to last. And if the teacher takes care of things and the children take care of things, it can really almost last forever. See, I have materials in London that were made in 1926, and they were used by a class of children up to 1940. Then the school had to be closed because it was in the path of the bombers that were coming over southern England. And when the centre was started, all these materials were given to us, and they were just as good as when they were made. See? In fact, the students are rather harder on the materials than the children are. Yes, they're so anxious to get things done quickly, I think. So it has to be well made and it has to be beautiful. So again, the child in using it is having his aesthetic sense educated as well. Now, if you give the children something, beautiful things, well-made things, again, they are attracted to them. If you give them the best, then they will use the materials far more than if you give them something rather poor and shoddy. But the teacher, of course, is the sort of central person in the school, and she has to see that the materials are always well kept. They're clean, polished, Nothing is lost, nothing is broken. She just glances round before the children leave to make sure the baby pink tower is there, or the smallest cylinder. She knows the children love those, and they're used to putting things in their pockets. They don't know anything about what's yours and mine, and they're apt to put those things in their pockets. Or they just carry that baby pink tower around with them, you know. So you keep an eye and see them. And if a piece is lost, then that piece of material is put away in the stock cupboard until there's a replacement. Or if by any chance anything should get broken, then that again, like the knob of a cylinder, I've never known it happen, but I suppose it could. Sometimes, you know, bringing material to a country like California, where you have very dry weather, there's a shrinkage of wood, and therefore a knob can get loose and come out. Or now we find that where we have central heating, you must not keep the cabinet on top of a radiator because it dries out, and the best wood there is, you will get slight warping, or the knobs will get loose and come out. You have to store wood properly. And so if that happens, then it has to be taken out of the classroom until it's been repaired, you see, because the children can't have things, they don't work well with things that are not complete, well kept, and so on. Now, once we know the points to look for behind a piece of material, then if there's any new knowledge, we know how to make the materials whereby we can teach that knowledge. You see, because no classroom is ever static. We are adding knowledge at a terrific rate. You see, possibly not at the point of the nursery school, because they're not taking in the new knowledge that is coming along. But when they get a little later, a little older, then we always have to see that we give them knowledge which is up to date. We know how to make the simple, attractive materials. We know how to isolate the difficulty or isolate the point we're teaching, and therefore we can make materials to teach anything new that we have to teach. And we do have to keep up to date for the children. And as I say, it won't be at this very young age.